Sometimes the people who need saving the most are the ones who think they're beyond redemption. For Rowe McKenzie, a lonely mountain man in 1870s Montana, that truth would change everything when he found a wounded native girl hiding in his barn. She was maybe 7 years old, bleeding and scared, speaking no English and trusting no one. Most folks would have taken her straight to the authorities. But when Rowe looked into those frightened eyes, he saw something that stirred memories he'd buried deep, the daughter he'd lost, the family torn away by tragedy. As winter approached and dangerous men started searching the valley for the girl, Rowe faced an impossible choice. He could turn her in and go back to his quiet, empty life. Or he could risk everything to protect a child who reminded him what it meant to have something worth fighting for. What would you do if saving someone else meant facing your darkest memories? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains like a shroud, and Rowe McKenzie stood on his cabin's weathered porch, coffee steaming in his calloused hands. At 58, his beard had gone more grey than brown, and his eyes, the colour of winter sky, held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much and saying too little. The silence up here was complete, broken only by the distant call of a hawk and the whisper of wind through the pines. This was how Rowe preferred it. Solitude had become his closest companion these past 5 years, ever since the fever took his wife Helen and their daughter Charlotte within a week of each other. The memory still hit him like a physical blow sometimes, catching him off guard when he least expected it. Charlotte would have been 12 now, probably helping her mother tend the vegetable garden they'd started behind the cabin, or pestering him to teach her how to track elk through the timber. But there was no garden now, just wild grass and encroaching brush. No laughter echoing off the log walls, no small hands tugging at his coat sleeve. Just the carved wooden horse he kept hidden in his dresser drawer, the last toy he'd whittled for Charlotte before she got sick. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away, but he couldn't bear to look at it either. Rowe's cabin sat in a natural clearing about 3 miles up Willow Creek, surrounded by towering Douglas fir and lodgepole pine. He'd built it himself in the spring of '63, when he first came to Montana Territory with hopes of making a new start after the war. The structure was solid, thick log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone foundation that would outlast him, and a shake roof that shed rain like a duck's back. 2 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace that could heat the whole place, and a smaller bedroom where he and Helen had planned to raise their children. Behind the cabin stood his barn, a smaller but equally sturdy building where he kept his 2 horses, Buck, a steady bay gelding, and Molly, a mare with more attitude than sense. The barn also held his traps, his winter supply of hay, and the various pelts he'd collected over the seasons. Trapping beaver, marten, and the occasional wolf pelt provided enough income for his simple needs. Along with the vegetables he grew and the game he hunted, the nearest settlement was Pine Ridge, a day's hard ride down the mountain. It wasn't much, maybe 200 souls clustered around a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings. There was Murphy's General Store, where Vera Mullins held court behind the counter with all the authority of a frontier matriarch. The Silver Dollar Saloon drew cowboys and drifters looking to forget their troubles in rotgut whiskey. Sheriff Bradley Cormack kept what peace could be kept with a steady hand and a fair mind. Though his jurisdiction stretched thin across the vast territory, Rowe made the trip to Pine Ridge once a month, sometimes twice if the weather held. He'd load his pack mule with furs, ride down to trade with Vera for supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, and the occasional luxury like a can of peaches or a bar of real soap. The townsfolk knew him as a reliable but distant figure, a man who paid his debts and minded his own business. They respected that in a place where asking too many questions could get you into trouble. He'd never told them about his past, about the uniform he'd worn or the battles he'd fought. As far as Pine Ridge knew, Rowe McKenzie was just another mountain man trying to make an honest living in hard country. They didn't know about the sleepless nights when the ghosts of war mixed with the ghosts of family, creating a pain so deep it felt like drowning. The war had changed him, shaped him into something harder than the young farmer who'd enlisted in '61. He'd learned to kill efficiently, to make decisions that haunted him, to carry out orders that went against everything he'd been raised to believe about right and wrong. By the time Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Rowe had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. He'd thought coming to Montana would wash that stain away, but some marks go too deep to scrub clean. Helen had understood somehow. She'd been a schoolteacher in Denver when they met, a woman with gentle hands and a fierce intelligence that could see right through his gruff exterior. She'd known about the nightmares, the way he sometimes startled awake reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. But she'd also seen something in him worth saving, and she'd loved him with a patience that gradually built trust where suspicion had lived. Charlotte had been the light of their world, a bright, curious child who asked 1,000 questions and believed her father could answer them all. She'd had Helen's dark hair and Rowe's grey eyes, and a laugh that could chase away the darkest thoughts. When she was 4, she'd started following him on short hunting trips, learning to read tracks and identify bird calls. By 6, she could help him skin a rabbit and knew which plants were safe to eat if you got lost in the woods. The fever had come without warning in late autumn. First Charlotte, complaining of a headache and refusing her supper. Then Helen, burning up but shivering like she'd never get warm again. Rowe had ridden through a blizzard to fetch Doc Patterson from Pine Ridge, but there was nothing to be done except watch them slip away. Charlotte went first, so small in the bed she'd shared with her parents. Helen followed 3 days later, whispering Charlotte's name with her last breath. Rowe had buried them on the hill behind the cabin, beneath the big pine where Charlotte used to sit and watch for his return from hunting trips. He'd carved their names into wooden markers, simple and clean, the way Helen would have liked. Every morning for the first year, he'd walked up that hill to talk to them, telling them about his day, about the weather, about anything that might keep them close. But eventually, even that became too painful. And now he only visited on their birthdays and the anniversary of their deaths. The isolation had been his choice, his way of protecting what was left of his heart from further damage. He'd convinced himself it was better this way, safer to want nothing and expect nothing from a world that seemed determined to take away everything he loved. The mountain didn't judge him or ask questions he couldn't answer. It simply existed, indifferent to his pain, but offering a kind of harsh comfort in its permanence. But this morning felt different somehow, though Rowe couldn't put his finger on why. There was a tension in the air, a sense that change was coming whether he wanted it or not. He'd learned to trust such feelings during the war. They'd kept him alive more than once. Something was stirring in the quiet world he'd built for himself. Something that would test every wall he'd constructed around his damaged heart. The coffee had gone cold in his hands while he'd been lost in memories. He dumped the dregs over the porch rail and turned to go back inside, planning to check his traps before the day got too warm. That's when he saw it, a dark stain on the wooden steps leading up to the porch. Not coffee or mud, but something else. Something that made his pulse quicken with an old soldier's instinct for trouble. Blood. Fresh enough that it hadn't had time to dry completely, but old enough to have darkened from red to brown. A small amount, like someone had been hurt but trying to hide it. Rowe knelt and touched the edge of the stain with his fingertip. Still slightly tacky. This had happened in the last few hours, probably while he'd been asleep. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the area around the cabin with new intensity. There, another spot on the ground near the corner of the building, and another leading toward the barn. Someone had been here, someone injured and trying to stay hidden. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt 45 on his hip, a habit from the war that had never completely faded. The trail was faint but readable if you knew how to look. Whoever it was had been careful, trying to step on rocks and hard ground where they wouldn't leave clear prints. But blood was harder to hide, especially when you were hurt and scared. The spots led in a meandering line from the tree line to his barn, disappearing around the corner where the big doors stood slightly ajar. Rowe had latched those doors the night before. He was certain of it. Someone had opened them from the inside. He approached the barn with the cautious step of a man who'd learned that carelessness could get you killed. The morning sun slanted through gaps in the board siding, creating bars of golden light across the hay-strewn floor. Buck and Molly stood in their stalls, ears pricked forward with interest. They weren't spooked, which meant whoever was in here wasn't threatening them. But their attention was focused on the hayloft above, where a ladder led to the storage area, where Rowe kept his winter feed. The blood trail led to the bottom of that ladder and disappeared upward into the shadows. Rowe drew his pistol and held it ready, though something told him he wouldn't need it. Call it instinct or just the way his horses were behaving, but this didn't feel like a trap or an ambush. It felt like someone hiding, someone who needed help more than they needed to cause trouble. "I know you're up there," he called softly, his voice carrying easily in the confined space. "I'm not going to hurt you, but I need to know who you are and what you're doing in my barn." Silence answered him, but it was the kind of silence that held its breath, waiting and listening. Someone was definitely up there. Rowe holstered his gun and moved to the ladder. "I'm coming up. If you've got a weapon, now would be a good time to tell me." Still nothing, but as he climbed the rough wooden rungs, he heard something that made him pause. The faint sound of rapid, shallow breathing. Someone was trying very hard to be quiet and not quite succeeding. The hayloft was dim and warm, filled with the sweet smell of dried grass and the dusty golden light that filtered through the cracks. At first, Rowe saw nothing out of place. Bales of hay stacked along the walls, his collection of traps hanging from the rafters. A few old saddles and pieces of tack he hadn't used in years. Then he saw her. She was small, no bigger than Charlotte had been, pressed back into the far corner where the shadows were deepest. Dark hair hanging in tangled strands around a face streaked with dirt and dried tears. Her clothes, a simple dress made from what looked like deerskin, were torn and stained with blood that matched the trail he'd followed from his porch. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Wide and dark and filled with a terror so profound it hit him like a physical blow. She was looking at him the way a cornered animal looks at a predator, ready to fight or die, but never to surrender. She was native, Lakota if he had to guess, though he'd seen enough tribal variations during the war to know he might be wrong. What he wasn't wrong about was her age. 7, maybe 8 years old at the most. A child, alone and hurt, and more frightened than anyone that young should ever have to be. And in those terrified eyes, Rowe McKenzie saw the ghost of his daughter looking back at him. For a long moment, neither moved. The girl pressed herself deeper into the corner, her small hands clutching something against her chest, a beaded leather pouch that caught what little light filtered through the barn slats. Rowe could see her trembling, could hear the rapid breathing that spoke of exhaustion and terror held barely in check. "Easy now," he said, using the same gentle tone he'd once used to calm spooked horses and frightened children. "I'm not going to hurt you." The words meant nothing to her, of course. She probably didn't speak a word of English. But tone was universal, and after a moment her breathing slowed just slightly. She was still watching him with those enormous dark eyes, still ready to bolt if he made any sudden moves. Rowe settled himself on a hay bale about 10 feet away, far enough to give her space, but close enough to see her injuries. Now that his eyes had adjusted to the dim light, he could make out more details that made his chest tighten with anger at whoever had done this to a child. Her dress was torn in several places, revealing scrapes and bruises on her arms and legs. There was dried blood on her forehead, where something had cut her scalp, not deep, but head wounds always bled more than they should. Her feet were bare and scratched from running through rough terrain. Most telling of all, there were rope burns around her thin wrists, faded but still visible. Someone had tied her up. Someone had hurt this child, and she had somehow escaped. "You've been running for a while," Rowe said quietly, more to fill the silence than because he expected her to understand. Long way from wherever you started, I'd guess. He studied her face, trying to place which tribe she might belong to. The beadwork on her dress looked Lakota, but he could be wrong. During his time in the cavalry, he'd learned enough to know that assumptions about tribal affiliations could get you killed. What mattered right now wasn't where she came from, but how badly she was hurt, and what had driven her to seek shelter in his barn. The girl's grip on the medicine pouch never loosened. Whatever was inside it, it meant something to her, maybe the only piece of home she had left. Rowe had seen that kind of desperate attachment before, in soldiers who carried lucky coins or letters from sweethearts. Something to hold on to when everything else had been stripped away. "You hungry?" he asked, miming eating with his hand. "Food." At the word food, her eyes sharpened with interest, though she still didn't move from her defensive position. When had she last eaten? From the hollow look of her cheeks, it had been a while. Rowe stood slowly, telegraphing every movement so she wouldn't bolt. "I'm going to go get you something to eat. You stay right here, understand?" "Stay!" He pointed to the spot where she sat, then to his own eyes, then back to her. The universal gesture for, "I see you, you stay put." She gave the tiniest nod, more of a twitch really, but it was acknowledgement. Climbing back down the ladder, Rowe's mind raced through possibilities. The smart thing would be to ride to Pine Ridge and fetch Sheriff Cormac. A missing native child was serious business, especially with tensions running high between the territorial government and the various tribes. There had been talk in town of raiding parties and retaliation strikes, rumors of children taken on both sides of the conflict. But something in those terrified eyes held him back. She wasn't just scared. She was traumatized in a way that spoke of sustained abuse, not just the shock of being separated from her family. The rope burns on her wrists suggested she'd been a captive, not a refugee from a raid. And if she'd escaped from captivity, turning her over to the authorities might mean sending her right back to whoever had hurt her. In the cabin, Rowe gathered supplies quickly. A tin cup of water, some leftover biscuits from his breakfast, a jar of honey to tempt her appetite, and most importantly, clean cloth and his small supply of medical items. The cuts on her head and arms needed tending, and those rope burns could fester if they weren't properly cleaned. He also grabbed an old shirt of Helen's, soft cotton that would be gentler against injured skin than the rough deerskin dress the girl wore. The shirt still smelled faintly of the lavender soap Helen had favored, a scent that brought back memories he usually kept locked away. But if it might comfort a frightened child, it was worth the pain. When he climbed back up to the loft, she was exactly where he'd left her, though her eyes tracked his every movement as he settled on the hay bale with his supplies spread between them. He held up the cup of water first, taking a sip to show it was safe, before setting it on the floor halfway between them. She stared at it with naked longing, but didn't move. "It's all right," Rowe said softly. "Take it." Minutes passed. Then, moving with the careful precision of a wild animal approaching a trap, she crept forward and snatched the cup, retreating immediately to her corner. She drank deeply, water running down her chin as she drained every drop. The biscuits followed the same pattern, offered, considered, finally accepted with desperate hunger. She ate like someone who wasn't sure when her next meal might come, cramming food into her mouth faster than she could properly chew. Rowe had seen that kind of starvation eating before, in refugee camps and among prisoners of war. It told a story he didn't want to contemplate too closely. While she ate, he noticed her watching him with new interest. The immediate terror was fading, replaced by wary calculation. She was smart, this one, smart enough to recognize that he could have hurt her already if that had been his intention. Smart enough to know that someone offering food and water might be the first real help she'd encountered in however long she'd been running. When she finished eating, Rowe pointed to the medical supplies. "You're hurt," he said, touching his own forehead where she had been cut. "Let me help." She shook her head violently, pressing back against the wall. "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "I know you don't trust me, but those cuts need cleaning, or they'll get infected. You understand infection?"
Sickness?
He wasn't sure she understood the words, but his tone seemed to convey his meaning. After a long moment, she inched forward slightly, close enough for him to see the wounds more clearly. The cut on her forehead wasn't as bad as he'd feared, shallow but dirty, with bits of bark and debris that needed to come out. The scrapes on her arms were worse, deep enough to need careful cleaning. But it was the rope burns that made his jaw clench with anger. They were several days old, partially healed, but still raw in places. Someone had kept this child tied up for long enough that the ropes had worn through her skin. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly, though he knew she wouldn't answer even if she could understand. "What kind of animal ties up a little girl?" She flinched at the harsh tone, and he immediately softened his voice.
"Not you."
"I'm not angry at you. Someone hurt you, didn't they? Someone bad." As he began cleaning her wounds with careful, gentle strokes, she sat perfectly still, though he could feel the tension in her small frame. She was enduring rather than accepting his help, prepared to run at the first sign of real threat. But she let him work, let him clean away the dirt and debris that could have poisoned her blood. The medicine pouch never left her grip, even when he had to maneuver around her arms to reach the worst of the scrapes. It was beautiful work, intricate beadwork in patterns he didn't recognize, with small bones and carved stones sewn into the leather. Sacred items, probably. Things that connected her to family, to home, to a world that seemed very far away from this Montana barn. When he finished with the medical care, he held up Helen's shirt. The girl's eyes widened as she took in the clean fabric, the careful stitching, the feminine details that marked it as women's clothing. She looked from the shirt to Rowe and back again, a question in her dark eyes. "It belonged to my wife," he said simply. "She died, but she would have wanted you to have it if it helps." The girl reached out tentatively and touched the soft cotton, then looked up at Rowe with something that might have been the beginning of trust. She took the shirt and clutched it against her chest, alongside the medicine pouch, two talismans from different worlds. As the morning wore on, Rowe found himself facing a decision he wasn't prepared to make. The right thing, the legal thing, was to take her to Pine Ridge and turn her over to Sheriff Cormac. There were proper channels for dealing with lost or displaced native children, treaties and territorial agreements that governed such situations. But those same agreements had failed to protect her from whatever had happened to leave her tied up and traumatized. Those proper channels might send her right back to the people who had hurt her, or to some other situation where she'd be just another problem to be solved, rather than a child who needed safety and healing. And there was something else, something he wasn't quite ready to admit to himself. Sitting here in the warm, dusty light of the hayloft, watching this brave little girl clutch her sacred pouch and his dead wife's shirt, Rowe felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Purpose. The sense that maybe, just maybe, there was still something in this world worth protecting. The girl, he would have to find out her name somehow, had fallen asleep sitting up, her head tilted against the wall, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. In sleep, her face lost some of its wariness, revealing the child she should have been allowed to be. She couldn't be much older than Charlotte had been when the fever took her. Rowe sat watching her sleep and felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. He'd told himself that isolation was safer, that caring about nothing meant losing nothing. But looking at this injured child who had somehow found her way to his barn, he realized that maybe some things were worth the risk. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. He wouldn't take her to Pine Ridge today, not until he knew more about what had happened to her, not until he was sure that turning her over to the authorities wouldn't mean betraying the trust he could see beginning to form in those dark eyes. She would stay, at least for now. And for the first time in 5 years, Rowe McKenzie would have someone to worry about besides himself. 3 days passed, like pages turning in a book Rowe had never expected to read. Each morning, he climbed the ladder to the hayloft with food and water, and each evening he returned to check on the girl's wounds and change her bandages. She had moved from the corner to a nest she'd made in the hay near the ladder, close enough to escape quickly if needed, but far enough from the shadows to catch the warm afternoon light that slanted through the barn boards. On the first morning, she had been awake and waiting when he climbed up, her eyes tracking his every movement with the wariness of a deer ready to bolt. By the third morning she was still awake and watching, but her posture had relaxed slightly. She no longer pressed herself against the wall when he approached, and she had stopped flinching every time he moved his hands. The wounds were healing well. The cut on her forehead was already beginning to scab over, and the scrapes on her arms were clean and free of infection. But it was the rope burns that told the real story of her recovery, not just the physical healing, but the way she had started to rub her wrists less frequently, as if she was beginning to believe that no one would tie her up again. She still clutched the medicine pouch constantly, but Helen's shirt had become equally precious to her. She wore it over her deerskin dress like a talisman, the soft cotton a stark contrast to the rougher leather. Sometimes Rowe caught her burying her face in the fabric, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that still clung to the threads. Communication remained a challenge built on gestures and patience. Rowe had started a journal to track their interactions, writing in the margins of an old account book he used for recording trap yields. The act of writing helped him organize his thoughts, and somehow it felt important to document this strange new chapter of his life. Day 1. Found her in the barn, injured but not seriously. Rope burns suggest captivity. Speaks no English. Lakota, I think, based on the beadwork. Terrified but intelligent. Has eaten little but accepted water readily. Day 2. Less fearful today. Allowed me to clean wounds properly. Still won't let me get within arm's reach unless necessary. Made small sound when I mentioned food. First vocalization. Might be beginning to understand some words. Day 3. Definite progress. Watched me eat before accepting her own food. Touched my hand briefly when I was bandaging her arm. First voluntary contact. Beginning to believe she might survive whatever happened to her. The journal entries were spare, clinical, but they couldn't capture the moments that mattered most. The way her eyes lit up when he brought her honey with the morning biscuits. The careful attention she paid when he spoke to her, as if she was trying to decode not just his words, but his intentions. The small, almost imperceptible relaxation in her shoulders when she realized he was leaving food within her reach, rather than trying to hand-feed her like a child. Most significantly, she had begun to venture down from the loft when she thought he wasn't around. Rowe had discovered this by accident on the second evening, when he'd approached the barn, more quietly than usual, and seen her small figure dart back up the ladder at his approach. The next morning, he'd found evidence of her explorations. A water bucket moved slightly, hay scattered in a pattern that suggested someone small had been walking around the barn floor. Rather than confront her about it, he had started leaving the barn door open during the day. If she wanted to explore, at least she could do it safely. But she never went outside, never tried to run. The world beyond the barn seemed to hold more terror for her than the strange mountain man who brought her food and tended her wounds. On the third evening, as autumn shadows grew longer and the first real chill settled into the mountain air, Rowe sat in his cabin and faced the reality of what keeping her meant. Winter was coming. He could smell it in the wind and feel it in his bones. Up here at elevation, snow could start falling as early as October, and once it started, it wouldn't stop until April or May. If she was going to stay, he needed to make real preparations. The barn was no place for a child to spend a Montana winter, even wrapped in every blanket he owned. She would need proper shelter, warm clothes, food stores that went beyond his bachelor rations of hardtack and jerky. More importantly, she would need a name, at least something he could call her besides the girl. He had been thinking about this for 2 days, running through possibilities. She was Lakota, he was fairly certain, which meant her real name would be in her own language. But until he could learn what that name was, he needed something to bridge the gap. He thought about Helen, about the way she had chosen names for the children they'd hoped to have after Charlotte. She had always favored names with meaning, names that carried hopes and wishes for the future. For a daughter, she had once suggested Ayanna, eternal blossom, in some tribal language she'd read about in one of her books, Ayana. It felt right, somehow. This name Helen had loved but never gotten to use. If he was going to protect this child, if he was going to give her a place in his carefully ordered world, she deserved a name that spoke of growth and hope rather than fear and running. The next morning, when he climbed to the loft with her breakfast, "He tried it out, Ayana," he said softly, setting the plate of food within her reach. "Would you like that, Ayana?" She tilted her head at the sound, her dark eyes curious. It wasn't her real name. He could tell that from her lack of recognition. But something in his tone, in the gentleness with which he spoke it, seemed to resonate with her. She repeated it back to him, her voice small and uncertain but clear. Ayana. It was the first word she had spoken aloud, and the sound of it hit Rowe like a physical blow. Not because of the name itself, but because of what it represented. Trust, the beginning of communication. A willingness to accept something from him beyond mere survival necessities. "That's right," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Ayana," she smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, small but genuine. It transformed her face completely, revealing the spirited child hiding beneath the layers of trauma and caution. For just a moment, she looked like what she should have been, a 7-year-old girl delighting in learning something new, rather than a refugee clinging to life in a stranger's barn. That smile decided it for Rowe. Whatever the consequences, whatever complications it might bring, he wasn't turning this child over to anyone until he was certain she would be safe. She had chosen to trust him with her first English word, had accepted the name he'd given her with Helen's memory woven into it. That trust was a responsibility he couldn't take lightly. That evening, he began making plans in earnest. The cabin would need modifications, a partition in the main room to give her privacy, additional bedding, warmer clothes. He would need to expand his food stores, maybe trade some of his better pelts for supplies before winter set in completely. But first, he needed to know more about what had happened to her, where she had come from and who might be looking for her. The rope burns, and her state of terror suggested someone had taken her against her will. But from where? And how had she ended up so far into the mountains that she'd found his isolated barn? These were questions that would need careful handling. Pushed too hard, and she might retreat back into silence. But if dangerous people were looking for her, he needed to be prepared. As he wrote in his journal that night by the light of a kerosene lamp, Rowe reflected on how quickly his world had changed. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been checking his trap lines and preparing for the seasonal fur trade. Now he found himself responsible for a traumatized child who didn't speak his language, planning modifications to a cabin that had been designed for solitude. She accepted the name Ayana and spoke it aloud, first word in English. "Real progress today." Smiled for the first time, beginning to plan for longer-term arrangements. Cannot shake the feeling that keeping her will bring complications, but the alternative feels wrong. She trusts me now. That matters more than regulations or proper channels. Tomorrow, I need to start thinking about winter preparations. Also need to consider what I'll say if anyone comes looking. The truth that I found an injured child and am caring for her should be enough for most reasonable people. But reasonable people don't tie up 7-year-olds. He closed the journal and looked toward the barn, where a thin strip of light showed through the gap under the door. She was probably settling down for the night, wrapped in the blankets he'd provided, still clutching that medicine pouch and Helen's shirt. For the first time in 5 years, Rowe McKenzie fell asleep, thinking about someone other than ghosts. A week and a half after finding Ayana, Rowe knew he couldn't postpone his supply run to Pine Ridge any longer. His coffee was running low, and more importantly, he needed materials to prepare the cabin for winter, with a child to consider. But the thought of leaving her alone, even for a day, sat uneasily in his chest. The morning of his departure, he climbed to the loft to find her awake and watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. She had grown comfortable with their routine, but something in his manner, the way he carried his saddlebags, The careful way he was dressed told her this was different. "I have to go to town," he said, settling onto his usual hay bale. He had taken to speaking to her in full sentences, even knowing she understood only fragments. Somehow it felt important to treat her like the intelligent child she was, rather than reducing everything to gestures and single words. "I'll be back tomorrow." "One day." He held up a finger to illustrate, then pointed to the sun's position and traced its arc across the sky. "One sun, then I come back." Her face crumpled with worry, and she clutched the medicine pouch tighter. In the past week, Rowe had become the one constant in her world. The bringer of food and safety, the gentle voice that meant no harm would come to her. The prospect of his absence clearly terrified her. "I know," he said softly. "I don't want to leave you either. But I need things. Warm clothes for you, more food, supplies for winter." He had prepared for this moment, knowing words alone wouldn't be enough to reassure her. From his pocket, he drew out something he hadn't touched in 5 years. The iron cross that Helen had worn, a simple thing blessed by the circuit preacher who'd married them. It had been among her effects when she died, and he'd kept it in his dresser drawer alongside Charlotte's wooden horse. Too painful to look at, but too precious to throw away. But last night, as he'd lain awake planning for today, he'd realized it might serve a different purpose. Not as a religious symbol, he wasn't sure what Ayana's people believed about such things, but as a promise. Something solid and real that said he would return. "This was my wife's," he said, holding the cross so she could see it clearly. "Helen's. It's very important to me, do you understand?" "Very precious." Ayana's eyes fixed on the cross, taking in its worn silver surface and the delicate chain from which it hung. She might not understand the Christian symbolism, but she clearly recognized its importance to him. "I'm leaving it with you," Rowe continued, extending it toward her, "because I'm coming back. This is my promise. I will return for this and for you." She took the cross with reverent care, her small fingers closing around the cool metal. Then, in a gesture that nearly undid him completely, she lifted the chain over her head so that the cross hung alongside her medicine pouch. 2 talismans now, one from her world, one from his, both precious beyond measure. Before he lost his courage, Rowe left extra food and water, checked the barn one more time to ensure it was secure, and saddled Buck for the long ride to Pine Ridge. As he led the gelding from the barn, he could feel Ayana watching from the loft window, her small face pressed against the boards. The ride down the mountain gave him time to think, to rehearse the careful balance he would need to strike in town. He couldn't buy children's clothing without raising questions, but he could purchase fabric and claim he was trading with native families. He needed information about any disturbances in the region, but he couldn't ask direct questions without seeming suspicious. Most importantly, he needed to gauge whether anyone was actively searching for a missing native child. Pine Ridge looked the same as always, a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, horses tied to hitching posts, the constant bustle of a frontier town going about its business. But to Rowe's heightened awareness, every conversation seemed potentially significant. Every glance in his direction felt weighted with suspicion. He started at Murphy's General Store, where Vera Mullins held court behind the counter like a frontier queen surveying her domain. Vera was in her 50s, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of no-nonsense manner that came from raising 6 children on the frontier. She also knew everyone's business within 50 miles, which made her both valuable and dangerous to someone with secrets. "Well, look what the mountain dragged down," she said with a smile as he entered. "Haven't seen you in, 6 weeks? Thought maybe the bears had finally gotten you." "Still breathing," Rowe replied, returning her smile with genuine warmth. He'd always liked Vera, appreciated her straightforward manner and the way she treated everyone fairly regardless of their station. "Need to stock up before the snow flies. Little early for winter supplies, isn't it?" Vera observed, pulling out her account book. "Usually you wait until October for the heavy provisioning. Learned my lesson last year," Rowe said easily. "Got caught short when that early storm hit in September. Figure it's better to be prepared." It was a reasonable explanation, and Vera accepted it without question. As she tallied his usual order of coffee, flour, salt, and ammunition, Rowe added items that would have seemed odd for a bachelor mountain man. Several yards of soft wool fabric, needles and thread, a selection of buttons, and 2 pairs of small leather boots that the store kept for trading with native families. Vera raised an eyebrow at the children's boots, but didn't comment directly. "Doing some trading this winter?" "Thinking about it," Rowe replied. "Might be good to build some relationships before the trapping season gets serious." While Vera wrapped his purchases, Rowe listened to the conversations flowing around the store. 2 cowboys discussing a missing herd, a farmer complaining about early frost damaging his corn, a traveling preacher planning his circuit through the smaller settlements. Nothing about missing children. Nothing about search parties or rewards offered. Either Ayana's disappearance hadn't been reported, or the people looking for her weren't advertising the fact. His next stop was the Silver Dollar Saloon. Not for drink, but for information. The saloon was where news traveled fastest, where cowboys and drifters shared stories from across the territory. If there was trouble brewing anywhere in the region, someone at the Silver Dollar would know about it. The afternoon crowd was light, a few regulars nursing beers, a poker game in the corner that looked like it had been running for days. Rowe ordered a whiskey he didn't want and struck up a conversation with the bartender, a man named Dutch who'd been pouring drinks in Pine Ridge for the better part of a decade. "Quiet lately," Rowe observed, sipping his whiskey. "Too quiet if you ask me," Dutch replied, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. "Usually this time of year, we get more travelers through. Folks heading south before winter sets in. Any trouble you heard about? Reason people might be staying away?" Dutch glanced around the saloon, then leaned closer. "There's been talk. Nothing official, mind you, but talk. Some of the boys who ride the northern ranges say they've seen signs of unrest among the tribal camps. Smoke signals during the day, unusual movement at night. What kind of unrest? Hard to say. Could be internal disputes, could be something more serious. Army's been asking questions too, sending patrols through areas they usually leave alone." Dutch straightened up as another customer approached. "Probably nothing, but it's got people nervous." Rowe finished his whiskey and left the saloon with more questions than answers. The picture emerging wasn't clear, but it suggested tensions between the territorial authorities and the native tribes in the region. That could explain Ayana's condition, caught in the middle of some conflict, separated from her family during a raid or forced relocation. His final stop was the sheriff's office, a calculated risk, but a necessary one. If Sheriff Cormac was dealing with reports of missing children, Rowe needed to know. And if he wasn't asking about them directly, he might learn something from the sheriff's general demeanor. Bradley Cormac was a good man, as frontier lawmen went, fair-minded, not quick to violence but capable of it when necessary. He'd served in the war like so many men of his generation, and it had left him with the same careful watchfulness that Rowe recognized in himself. "Rowe," the sheriff greeted him as he entered the small office. "Don't usually see you in town during the week. Needed supplies," Rowe replied. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're keeping the peace." Cormac laughed, but there was tension in it. "Peace is a relative term these days. Been getting reports of increased activity in the tribal areas. Nothing concrete, but enough to keep me worried. Anything I should be concerned about up on Willow Creek?" "Shouldn't think so. You're far enough out that you'd see trouble coming long before it reached you." Cormac studied Rowe's face carefully. "Everything all right up there? You seem a bit on edge." "Just the usual pre-winter nerves," Rowe said, forcing his posture to relax. "You know how it is. Once that snow starts falling, you're on your own until spring." It was another reasonable explanation, and Cormac seemed to accept it. But Rowe could feel the sheriff's sharp eyes following him as he left the office, and he made a mental note to be even more careful in the future. The ride back up the mountain felt longer than usual, weighted with the knowledge he'd gained and the growing complexity of his situation. By keeping Ayana, he was potentially inserting himself into a larger conflict between territorial authorities and tribal groups. But the alternative, turning a traumatized child over to people who might not have her best interests at heart, still felt wrong. As his cabin came into view in the fading evening light, Rowe felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the eager anticipation of homecoming. Not just returning to a place of shelter and solitude, but coming home to someone who would be watching for him, someone who would be relieved and happy to see him. The barn door was closed as he'd left it, but there was light visible through the cracks. Ayanna had lit the small lantern he'd left for her. As he led Buck into the barn and began unsaddling him, he heard movement in the loft above. "Ayanna?" he called softly. "I'm back. I told you I would come back." The sound that answered him was pure relief, a small cry of welcome that went straight to his heart. By the time he climbed the ladder to the loft, she was waiting for him, her face bright with joy, and the iron cross still hanging around her neck alongside her medicine pouch. She had kept faith with his promise, and he had kept faith with hers. It was, Rowe realized, the foundation of everything that would follow. 2 weeks had passed since Rowe's trip to Pine Ridge, and the rhythm of their shared existence had settled into something that felt almost natural. Ayanna had moved from the barn to the cabin on the 3rd night after his return, when the first hard frost made it clear that even with blankets, the barn was too cold for a child. She had claimed the corner near the fireplace, building herself a nest of quilts and buffalo hide that served as both bed and fortress. The transition hadn't been easy. The first night in the cabin, she had startled awake 3 times, eyes wide with terror, until she saw Rowe reading by the fire and remembered where she was. But gradually, the warmth and security of solid walls and a steady fire had worked their healing magic. Now she slept deeply, curled up with Helen's shirt still clutched in one small fist. Their communication had evolved beyond simple gestures and single words. Ayanna proved to be a quick student, absorbing English vocabulary with the hungry intelligence of a child who understood that language meant survival. She had learned the names for everything in the cabin: fire, water, food, warm, cold, safe. More importantly, she had begun to teach Rowe words in her own tongue. "Menni," she would say, pointing to the water bucket. "Peter" for fire. "Taku," when she wanted to know the English name for something new. Her voice was soft but clear, and Rowe found himself looking forward to these language lessons as much as any formal education he'd ever received. It was during one of these sessions, as they sat by the fire working on a beaded bracelet she had started making from materials found around the cabin, that Ayanna began to reveal more of her story. Not in words. She still lacked the English vocabulary for complex thoughts, but through the pictures she drew with charcoal on pieces of bark. The first drawing showed a cluster of teepees arranged in a circle, with small figures representing people going about their daily activities. Children playing, women tending fires, men returning from hunts. It was peaceful, orderly, a community living in harmony with the rhythms of the seasons. "Your home?" Rowe asked gently, pointing to the drawing. Ayanna nodded, then traced her finger around the circle of teepees with obvious affection. "Tiospe," she said. A Lakota word Rowe didn't recognize but understood from context meant family or community. The second drawing was darker, more violent. It showed the same circle of teepees, but now there were horses and riders surrounding them, and small figures lying motionless on the ground. Smoke rose from burning lodges, and in the center of the chaos, a smaller figure, clearly meant to be Ayanna herself, was being dragged away by one of the mounted men. Rowe's jaw tightened as he studied the crude but expressive artwork. "They attacked your village?" Ayanna nodded, her small hands clenched into fists. The memory was clearly painful, but there was anger there too, a fierce spirit that refused to be broken even by trauma that would have destroyed many adults. The third drawing showed a different place, a wooden building with barred windows and high walls. Inside, small figures sat huddled together, and one larger figure stood over them with what looked like a whip or stick. At the bottom of the bark, Ayanna had drawn rope marks around the wrists of the small figures. A fort. Rowe asked, though he suspected it was something worse. "A prison?" Ayanna struggled with the English words, then finally just pointed to her own wrists, where the rope burns had faded to thin white scars. The meaning was clear enough. Wherever she had been taken after the raid on her village, it had been a place of captivity and abuse. The final drawing was the most disturbing of all. It showed the same wooden building, but now one of the small figures was climbing through what looked like a window or gap in the wall. In the background, a larger figure lay motionless. Whether sleeping or dead, Rowe couldn't tell. But the escaping figure was clearly Ayana, and the expression she had managed to capture with simple charcoal strokes spoke of desperate determination. "You escaped," Rowe said, and there was admiration in his voice. "How long were you running before you found my barn?" Ayana held up fingers, first one hand then the other, then started over. "More than 10 days, possibly as many as 2 weeks. A 7-year-old child alone in the wilderness, surviving on nothing but courage and whatever survival skills her people had taught her." As the pictures revealed more of her story, Rowe found his anger growing, not at Ayana, but at whoever had been responsible for destroying her village and holding her captive. The rope burns, her terror of being tied up, the way she still sometimes flinched when he moved too quickly, all of it painted a picture of systematic abuse that made his blood boil. But along with the anger came a deeper understanding of what he had taken on by protecting her. This wasn't just a lost child who needed temporary shelter until her family could be located. This was a survivor of violence who had escaped from captivity, and whoever had been holding her was likely still looking for her. The implications were sobering. If Ayana had been taken during a raid on her village, possibly by rogue elements of the territorial militia or army, then harboring her could be seen as interfering with official business. Even if the raid had been illegal, even if her captivity had been unconscionable, Rowe would have a difficult time explaining why he hadn't reported finding her. That evening, as Ayana worked on her bracelet and Rowe pretended to read, he found himself studying her with new eyes. She was an extraordinary child, intelligent, resilient, possessed of a quiet strength that spoke well of how she had been raised before her world was torn apart. The beadwork she was creating from scraps of leather and colored thread showed real artistic ability, and the patterns she chose seemed to carry meanings he didn't understand but could sense were important. The bracelet itself had become a daily ritual for her, something to occupy her hands and mind during the long hours when Rowe was outside, checking traps or chopping wood. She worked on it with careful precision, adding 1 or 2 beads each day, creating something beautiful from whatever materials she could find around the cabin. "What does it mean?" he asked one evening, watching her add a small blue bead to the pattern. Ayana looked up from her work, considered his question, then pointed to herself and then to him. "Ikoda," she said, a word he didn't recognize. "Koda?" he repeated. She nodded, then made a gesture that encompassed both of them, then pointed to the bracelet. Whatever Koda meant, it was something that connected them, something important enough to be represented in the careful pattern she was creating. Over the following days, as autumn settled deeper into the mountains and the first snow dusted the higher peaks, their routine evolved into something that felt increasingly like family. Rowe found himself modifying not just his living space, but his entire way of life to accommodate Ayana's needs. He built a partition in the main room using a blanket hung from the rafters, giving her a private space while still allowing the heat from the fire to keep her warm. He showed her how to bank the coals at night and add wood in the morning, teaching her the fundamentals of fire management that could save her life in an emergency. Most importantly, he began to include her in his daily activities rather than leaving her alone in the cabin while he worked. She proved to be an eager student of mountain survival, learning to identify animal tracks, read weather signs, and find edible plants even as the growing season ended. But it was during their shared meals that Rowe felt the deepest sense of change in his life. For 5 years, he had eaten in silence, mechanically consuming whatever he had prepared without thought for anything beyond basic nutrition. Now he found himself looking forward to the simple ritual of sharing food with another person. of seeing Ayana's face light up when he surprised her with honey in her porridge or managed to catch a fish from the creek. She was changing too, growing more confident and expressive as her English improved and her trust in him deepened. The haunted look never completely left her eyes. The trauma she had endured would take far longer than a few weeks to heal. But she smiled more often now, and sometimes he caught her humming softly to herself as she worked on her bracelet or helped with simple chores around the cabin. The first real snow fell on a grey morning in early October, fat flakes drifting down from a leaden sky to dust the meadow around the cabin. Ayana had never seen snow before, or at least not the kind of heavy mountain snow that would soon bury the landscape under several feet of white silence. She stood in the doorway watching the flakes fall, her eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been homesickness. Snow would make travel nearly impossible until spring, effectively cutting them off from the outside world. For Rowe, that had always been a comfort, the knowledge that winter would bring months of peaceful isolation. But this year, as he watched Ayana reach out to catch snowflakes on her palm, he realized that isolation had taken on a different meaning. They would be alone together, dependent on each other for company and survival through the long, dark months ahead. It was both thrilling and terrifying, the first time in years that he had someone to worry about besides himself, and the first time since Helen and Charlotte that he had someone who seemed genuinely glad of his company. As the snow continued to fall and the world outside grew white and quiet, Rowe McKenzie found himself facing a truth he had been avoiding for weeks. Ayana wasn't just a temporary responsibility anymore. She wasn't a problem to be solved or a duty to be discharged when circumstances allowed. She was family, and like it or not, that changed everything. 2 weeks had passed since Rowe's trip to Pine Ridge, and the rhythm of their shared existence had settled into something that felt almost natural. Ayana had moved from the barn to the cabin on the third night after his return, when the first hard frost made it clear that even with blankets, the barn was too cold for a child. She had claimed the corner near the fireplace, building herself a nest of quilts and buffalo hide that served as both bed and fortress. The transition hadn't been easy. The first night in the cabin, she had startled awake 3 times, eyes wide with terror, until she saw Rowe reading by the fire and remembered where she was. But gradually, the warmth and security of solid walls and a steady fire had worked their healing magic. Now she slept deeply, curled up with Helen's shirt still clutched in one small fist. Their communication had evolved beyond simple gestures and single words. Ayana proved to be a quick student, absorbing English vocabulary with the hungry intelligence of a child who understood that language meant survival. She had learned the names for everything in the cabin: fire, water, food, warm, cold, safe. More importantly, she had begun to teach Rowe words in her own tongue. Mani, she would say, pointing to the water bucket. Peta for fire. Taku, when she wanted to know the English name for something new. Her voice was soft but clear, and Rowe found himself looking forward to these language lessons as much as any formal education he'd ever received. It was during one of these sessions, as they sat by the fire working on a beaded bracelet she had started making from materials found around the cabin, that Ayana began to reveal more of her story. Not in words. She still lacked the English vocabulary for complex thoughts, but through the pictures she drew with charcoal on pieces of bark. The first drawing showed a cluster of teepees arranged in a circle, with small figures representing people going about their daily activities. Children playing, women tending fires, men returning from hunts. It was peaceful, orderly, a community living in harmony with the rhythms of the seasons. "Your home?" Rowe asked gently, pointing to the drawing. Ayana nodded, then traced her finger around the circle of teepees with obvious affection. "Tiospai," she said, a Lakota word Rowe didn't recognize but understood from context meant family or community. The second drawing was darker, more violent. It showed the same circle of teepees, but now there were horses and riders surrounding them, and small figures lying motionless on the ground. Smoke rose from burning lodges, and in the center of the chaos, a smaller figure, clearly meant to be Ayana herself, was being dragged away by one of the mounted men. Rowe's jaw tightened as he studied the crude but expressive artwork. "They attacked your village?" Ayana nodded, her small hands clenched into fists. The memory was clearly painful, but there was anger there too, a fierce spirit that refused to be broken even by trauma that would have destroyed many adults. The third drawing showed a different place, a wooden building with barred windows and high walls. Inside, small figures sat huddled together, and one larger figure stood over them with what looked like a whip or stick. At the bottom of the bark, Ayana had drawn rope marks around the wrists of the small figures. "A fort?" Rowe asked, though he suspected it was something worse. "A prison." Ayana struggled with the English words, then finally just pointed to her own wrists, where the rope burns had faded to thin white scars. The meaning was clear enough. Wherever she had been taken after the raid on her village, it had been a place of captivity and abuse. The final drawing was the most disturbing of all. It showed the same wooden building, but now one of the small figures was climbing through what looked like a window or gap in the wall. In the background, a larger figure lay motionless. Whether sleeping or dead, Rowe couldn't tell. But the escaping figure was clearly Ayana, and the expression she had managed to capture with simple charcoal strokes spoke of desperate determination. Desperate determination. "You escaped," Rowe said, and there was admiration in his voice. "How long were you running?" "Before you found my barn?" Ayana held up fingers, first one hand, then the other, then started over. "More than 10 days, possibly as many as 2 weeks. A 7-year-old child, alone in the wilderness, surviving on nothing but courage and whatever survival skills her people had taught her." As the pictures revealed more of her story, Rowe found his anger growing, not at Ayana, but at whoever had been responsible for destroying her village and holding her captive. The rope burns, her terror of being tied up, the way she still sometimes flinched when he moved too quickly. All of it painted a picture of systematic abuse that made his blood boil. But along with the anger came a deeper understanding of what he had taken on by protecting her. This wasn't just a lost child who needed temporary shelter until her family could be located. This was a survivor of violence who had escaped from captivity, and whoever had been holding her was likely still looking for her. The implications were sobering. If Ayana had been taken during a raid on her village, possibly by rogue elements of the territorial militia or army, then harboring her could be seen as interfering with official business. Even if the raid had been illegal, even if her captivity had been unconscionable, Rowe would have a difficult time explaining why he hadn't reported finding her. That evening, as Ayana worked on her bracelet and Rowe pretended to read, he found himself studying her with new eyes. She was an extraordinary child, intelligent, resilient, possessed of a quiet strength that spoke well of how she had been raised before her world was torn apart. The beadwork she was creating from scraps of leather and colored thread showed real artistic ability, and the patterns she chose seemed to carry meanings he didn't understand but could sense were important. The bracelet itself had become a daily ritual for her, something to occupy her hands and mind during the long hours when Rowe was outside checking traps or chopping wood. She worked on it with careful precision, adding 1 or 2 beads each day, creating something beautiful from whatever materials she could find around the cabin. "What does it mean?" he asked one evening, watching her add a small blue bead to the pattern. Ayana looked up from her work, considered his question, then pointed to herself and then to him. "Coda," she said, a word he didn't recognize. "Coda," he repeated. She nodded, then made a gesture that encompassed both of them, then pointed to the bracelet. Whatever Coda meant, it was something that connected them, something important enough to be represented in the careful pattern she was creating. Over the following days, as autumn settled deeper into the mountains and the first snow dusted the higher peaks, their routine evolved into something that felt increasingly like family. Rowe found himself modifying not just his living space, but his entire way of life to accommodate Ayana's needs. He built a partition in the main room, using a blanket hung from the rafters, giving her a private space while still allowing the heat from the fire to keep her warm. He showed her how to bank the coals at night and add wood in the morning, teaching her the fundamentals of fire management that could save her life in an emergency. Most importantly, he began to include her in his daily activities rather than leaving her alone in the cabin while he worked. She proved to be an eager student of mountain survival, learning to identify animal tracks, read weather signs, and find edible plants, even as the growing season ended. But it was during their shared meals that Rowe felt the deepest sense of change in his life. For 5 years, he had eaten in silence, mechanically consuming whatever he had prepared, without thought for anything beyond basic nutrition. Now he found himself looking forward to the simple ritual of sharing food with another person, of seeing Ayana's face light up when he surprised her with honey in her porridge, or managed to catch a fish from the creek. She was changing too, growing more confident and expressive as her English improved, and her trust in him deepened. The haunted look never completely left her eyes. The trauma she had endured would take far longer than a few weeks to heal, but she smiled more often now. And sometimes he caught her humming softly to herself as she worked on her bracelet or helped with simple chores around the cabin. The first real snow fell on a grey morning in early October, fat flakes drifting down from a leaden sky to dust the meadow around the cabin. Ayana had never seen snow before, or at least not the kind of heavy mountain snow that would soon bury the landscape under several feet of white silence. She stood in the doorway, watching the flakes fall, her eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been homesickness. Snow would make travel nearly impossible until spring, effectively cutting them off from the outside world. For Rowe, that had always been a comfort, the knowledge that winter would bring months of peaceful isolation. But this year, as he watched Ayana reach out to catch snowflakes on her palm, he realized that isolation had taken on a different meaning. They would be alone together, dependent on each other for company and survival through the long, dark months ahead. It was both thrilling and terrifying, the first time in years that he had someone to worry about besides himself, and the first time since Helen and Charlotte that he had someone who seemed genuinely glad of his company. As the snow continued to fall and the world outside grew white and quiet, Rowe McKenzie found himself facing a truth he had been avoiding for weeks. Ayana wasn't just a temporary responsibility anymore. She wasn't a problem to be solved or a duty to be discharged when circumstances allowed. She was family. And like it or not, that changed everything. The snow that had begun as gentle flakes in early October had grown into the kind of serious mountain weather that made Rowe grateful for his years of careful preparation. By mid-November, the drifts reached nearly to the cabin's windows, and the world outside had transformed into a pristine wilderness of white silence broken only by the crack of trees splitting in the cold and the distant howl of wolves. Inside the cabin, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Ayana had not only adapted to her new environment, but had begun to make it her own. The beaded bracelet had grown longer and more intricate, its pattern revealing itself as something both beautiful and meaningful, a story told in colored thread and small carved bones that she had somehow fashioned from scraps. More significantly, she had begun to share fragments of her world with Rowe, teaching him not just words but concepts from her people's way of understanding the world. She showed him how to read the behavior of the horses to predict weather changes, demonstrated methods of preserving food that were more efficient than his crude frontier techniques, and most remarkably, began to share stories. Her English had improved dramatically, though it remained simple and sometimes fractured, but her ability to communicate complex ideas through gesture, expression, and careful word choice had grown into something approaching poetry. On the long winter evenings, when the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, she would tell him about her Tiospe, her extended family group, and the life she had known before the raid. "My grandmother," she said one evening, Working by firelight on her bracelet, she make medicine. No plants, no songs for healing. She touched the medicine pouch that still hung around her neck. Teach me little bit before. She gestured vaguely, unable or unwilling to put the violence into words. What kind of medicine? Rowe asked, genuinely curious. During the war, he had seen army doctors who knew less about treating wounds than some of the frontier women he'd encountered. Ayana considered the question, searching for English words to explain concepts that didn't translate easily. For fever, for hurt inside, for when spirit is broken. She looked at him directly, her dark eyes serious. Like you, the observation hit him like a physical blow. She saw through his carefully constructed facade of competence and self-sufficiency to the wounded man beneath. Somehow this 7-year-old child had recognized the spiritual damage that Helen's death had caused. Damage he thought he had hidden even from himself. "My spirit isn't broken," he said, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. Ayana tilted her head with the kind of patient compassion that seemed far too mature for her age. "Before I come, you talk to horses more than people. You keep pictures hidden." She pointed toward the dresser where he kept Charlotte's wooden horse and Helen's few remaining possessions. "You live like ghost." It was an uncomfortable truth, delivered with the stark honesty of childhood. Rowe had indeed been living like a ghost, going through the motions of existence without really inhabiting his own life. The isolation he had cultivated as protection had become a prison of his own making. "Maybe," he admitted quietly. "Maybe you're right." She smiled then, the kind of smile that transformed her entire face. "Good. Ghost not good for coda. What does that mean?" he asked. "That word you keep using, coda." Ayana set down her beadwork and considered how to explain. "In English you say friend but not same. Coda is—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Person who choose to be family. Not born family, but choose family. Person who fight for you, die for you if need." The weight of that definition settled between them, like another presence in the room. She wasn't just calling him a friend. She was claiming him as chosen family, someone worthy of the deepest loyalty her people could offer. And by accepting the term, by letting her teach it to him, he was making the same commitment in return. It was during these long winter conversations that Rowe began to understand the full scope of what he had taken on. Ayana wasn't just a child who needed temporary shelter until she could be reunited with her people. The drawings she had shown him suggested that her village had been destroyed, her family scattered or killed. She might be the sole survivor of whatever catastrophe had befallen her Tiospai. The thought kept him awake some nights, staring at the ceiling while she slept peacefully in her corner. What right did he have to make decisions about her future? What right did he have to keep her isolated in his mountain cabin when there might be other survivors looking for her? But then he would remember the rope burns, the terror in her eyes when he'd first found her, and he would know that whatever else happened, he couldn't let her fall into the wrong hands again. His old territorial map had become an obsession during the long winter evenings. He would spread it out on the table after Ayana had gone to sleep, studying the locations of known tribal territories, military posts, and settlements. Using the clues from her drawings and the few geographical details she had been able to share, he tried to piece together where she might have come from and who might have been responsible for the destruction of her village. The picture that emerged was troubling. Several tribal communities in the region had been relocated by territorial authorities over the past year, sometimes voluntarily, but often under threat of military action. There had been incidents, villages that had refused to move being dispersed by force, families separated, children taken to boarding schools or military compounds for education and civilization. Most of these actions had been officially sanctioned, part of the territorial government's policy of consolidating tribal populations in designated areas where they could be more easily monitored and controlled. But there had been rumors of unofficial actions as well, rogue military units, civilian militias, and opportunistic raiders who used the chaos of official relocations to pursue their own agendas. If Ayana had been caught in one of these unofficial actions, if her captivity had been part of some illegal scheme, then the people looking for her would have strong reasons to avoid official channels. They would be conducting their own search, using their own methods, unconstrained by legal niceties. The thought made his blood run cold. He had assumed that the winter weather would protect them, that the remoteness of his location would keep them safe until spring allowed for more considered decisions. But if dangerous people were actively searching for Ayana, if they had the resources and motivation to conduct winter operations, then his mountain cabin might not be the sanctuary he had hoped. These worries intensified when he began noticing signs that someone or something had been moving through the area despite the heavy snow. Tracks that appeared overnight and were gone by morning. Too indistinct to identify clearly, but suggesting large animals or possibly mounted men. Disturbances in the forest that could have been natural but felt somehow deliberate. He began checking his perimeter more carefully, studying the approaches to his cabin with the tactical awareness he had developed during the war. He cleaned and loaded weapons he hadn't touched in years, cached supplies in locations away from the cabin, and started planning escape routes that would allow them to disappear into the wilderness if necessary. But he was careful not to let his growing anxiety show around Ayana. She had found a measure of peace in their mountain sanctuary, and he didn't want to shatter that with fears that might prove groundless. She was still a child, still healing from traumas that ran deeper than physical wounds. She deserved whatever happiness and security he could provide, even if it might be temporary. One evening in late November, as they sat by the fire, sharing a dinner of rabbit stew and discussing the English names for different types of snow, Ayana surprised him with a question that cut straight to the heart of his anxieties. "When spring comes," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "you send me away?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Rowe realized that she had been thinking about this as much as he had, probably more. She understood that their current situation was temporary by necessity, that decisions would have to be made when travel became possible again. "Do you want me to?" he asked carefully. She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with the kind of intensity that suggested she was wrestling with complex emotions. When she finally spoke, her voice was small but determined. "My Tio Spaye is gone. Grandmother, mother, little brother, all gone. You show me their spirits in the smoke sometimes, but they not come back." She looked at him directly, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You are my Tio Spaye now. Only family I have." The simple statement hit him harder than any declaration of love or loyalty could have. She wasn't asking him to keep her out of sentiment or attachment. She was stating a fact as she saw it. Her original family was gone, and he had become her family by choice and circumstance. In her mind, the question wasn't whether he would send her away, but whether he would accept the responsibility that came with being chosen family. "Then you'll stay," he said. And the words felt like a promise that would reshape the rest of his life. "For as long as you want to stay, you'll have a home here." She smiled then, the first truly relaxed smile he had seen from her since the day she had accepted the name Ayana. The tension that had been building over weeks of unspoken uncertainty finally released. And for the first time since finding her in his barn, Rowe felt like they might actually have a future together. But even as he made that promise, even as he watched her return to her beadwork with renewed contentment, a part of his mind remained focused on the map spread out on his table and the growing certainty that their peace would not last much longer. The discovery came on a morning in early December, when the temperature had dropped so low that the coffee froze in the pot before Rowe could finish drinking it. He had been outside splitting wood for the stove when he heard Ayana call his name from inside the cabin, not in alarm, but with a note of curiosity that made him set down his axe and hurry inside. She was standing near his dresser, holding something in her small hands. At first, he couldn't see what had caught her attention, but then she turned toward him and his heart stopped. In her hands were his old military dog tags, the worn brass discs that identified him as Sergeant Rowe McKenzie, 7th Cavalry Regiment, United States Army. He had kept them buried in the back of his dresser drawer, wrapped in oilcloth beneath Helen's Bible and Charlotte's wooden horse, hidden away like the shameful secrets they represented. "What are these?" Ayanna asked, her voice carrying a confusion that would soon turn to something much worse. Rowe felt the blood drain from his face. In all his careful planning, in all his preparations for the complications that keeping Ayanna might bring, he had never considered that she might discover the most damaging truth about his past on her own. He began, then stopped. How could he explain what those tags meant? How could he make her understand that the man who had cared for her, who had become her chosen family, had once worn the uniform of the people who had destroyed her world? "Soldiers wear these," she said, her voice growing smaller. She had seen enough of military life during her captivity to recognize the tags for what they were. "You are soldier." "I was," Rowe said carefully. "A long time ago. Before I came here, before I met you." But Ayanna was already backing away from him, her dark eyes wide with dawning understanding and betrayal. The trust that had taken months to build was crumbling in real time, replaced by the same terror he had seen in her face that first day in the barn. "You are Wasiku," she whispered, using a Lakota word he didn't recognize, but whose meaning was clear from her tone. Enemy, outsider, the people who had taken everything from her. "Ayanna, listen to me." "No!" She clutched the tags against her chest as if they were evidence of his guilt. "You are one of them. You are one who hurt my people." The accusation hit him like a physical blow because it was true. Not directly. He had never participated in raids on peaceful villages, never been part of the actions that had destroyed her Tiospaye. But he had worn the same uniform, served the same cause, been part of the same system that had made her suffering possible. "It's not what you think," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. How could he explain the complexities of his military service to a child who had lived through the brutal consequences of that service? Ayanna was shaking now, her whole body trembling with a combination of fear and rage that made her seem older than her years. "My grandmother tells stories about Wasiku soldiers, how they come in mourning when people sleep, how they take children, hurt women, burn everything. I never did those things," Rowe said desperately. "I never hurt innocent people, never participated in raids on villages." "You have to believe me. Then why you have these?" She held up the dog tags like an accusation. "Why you keep soldier things if you're not proud of being soldier?" It was a question that cut to the heart of his deepest shame. Why had he kept the tags, kept the uniform, kept any reminders of a time in his life that had ended in disillusionment and guilt? Why hadn't he thrown them away the moment he decided to leave that life behind? "Because," he said quietly, "I was trying to forget who I had been." But forgetting and throwing away are different things. Ayanna stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her quick intelligence working through the implications of what she had discovered. This wasn't just about his past military service. It was about the foundation of their entire relationship. Had he saved her out of genuine compassion, or was this some extension of his military duty? Had his kindness been real, or was it another form of the paternalistic control that soldiers exercised over native people? "Tell me," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling. "Tell me what you did. Tell me about soldier time." Rowe closed his eyes, knowing that this moment had been inevitable from the day he chose to keep her. The truth had a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how deeply buried. And if he had any hope of salvaging their relationship, if he wanted to honor the trust she had placed in him, he would have to give her the complete truth, no matter how painful. "I enlisted in 1861, he began, settling into a chair but keeping his distance from her. "I was 19 years old, and I thought I was going to fight for the Union, to preserve the country and free the slaves. Noble causes." Ayanna remained standing, still clutching the dog tags, but she was listening. "For the first 2 years, that's what I did. I fought in battles against Confederate forces, Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg. I was a good soldier, got promoted, learned to lead men in combat. But in 1863, my unit was transferred to the frontier. Suddenly we weren't fighting to preserve the Union anymore. We were fighting to control territory, to enforce government policy against tribal nations. He paused, remembering those early days of frontier service when he had still believed in the righteousness of his cause. At first, I told myself it was the same noble mission, bringing civilization and order to lawless territory. But gradually, I began to see what that really meant. It meant forcing people from lands they had occupied for generations. It meant separating families, destroying ways of life that had sustained communities for centuries. It meant using military force against people whose only crime was wanting to live according to their own traditions. Ayana's grip on the dog tags had loosened slightly, but her expression remained guarded. I participated in actions I'm not proud of, Rowe continued. I helped enforce treaties that were fundamentally unfair. I was part of operations that relocated tribal communities to reservations where they couldn't sustain themselves. I followed orders that I knew were wrong because I was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders. You hurt my people, Ayana said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Rowe admitted. Not directly, not personally, but I was part of a system that hurt your people. I wore the uniform and carried out the policies that made tragedies like what happened to your village possible. Then why you save me? Why you care for me if I'm enemy? It was the crucial question, the one that would determine whether their relationship could survive this revelation. Rowe looked at her, this brave, intelligent child who had somehow found the strength to forgive him for being the kind of man she had every reason to hate, and knew that only complete honesty would suffice. Because somewhere along the way, I realized that the uniform I wore didn't make me a good man, he said. Following orders didn't make my actions right. And when I saw what my service was really accomplishing, the pain it was causing, the lives it was destroying, I couldn't continue. So you stopped being soldier? I finished my enlistment, but I never re-enlisted. I came to these mountains because I wanted to get as far away from that life as possible. I thought if I lived alone, if I didn't get involved with anyone else's problems, I could somehow make up for the harm I had done by doing no more harm. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the intense scrutiny of someone trying to determine whether they were being told the truth. But then I found you, Rowe continued. And I saw in your eyes the same fear and pain that I had seen in the eyes of people my unit had displaced, families we had separated, children we had taken from their homes. And I realized that trying to do no harm wasn't enough. Sometimes you have to actively try to heal the harm that's already been done. You try to heal harm by keeping me. I try to heal harm by protecting you, by giving you a place where you can be safe and loved and free to be who you are, by proving to myself that the man I became after the war is better than the man I was during it. Ayana set the dog tags down on the table between them, not throwing them, not hiding them, but placing them where they could both see them. The gesture felt significant, an acknowledgement that this truth would now be part of their relationship rather than a secret that might destroy it. My grandmother, she said slowly, she tell me that people can change, that what you do in past, not same as who you are now. She say that person who choose to be better is more important than person who never have to choose. The wisdom in those words, delivered in a child's careful English, hit Rowe with the force of absolution he had never expected to receive. Do you believe that? He asked. Ayana looked at him for a long moment, then walked over to where her beaded bracelet lay on the chair. She picked it up and studied the pattern she had been creating, the careful arrangement of colors and symbols that told a story only she fully understood. This bracelet, she said, it tells story of coda, not just friendship, not just family, but person who choose to be different because of love. She held it up so he could see the intricate beadwork. First part tells story of broken person who lose way, do wrong things, hurt others. But middle part tell different story. Tell about person who choose to heal, choose to protect. Choose to love. She looked directly at him. And for the first time since discovering the dog tags, there was warmth in her dark eyes. End part not finished yet, she said, because story still happening. But I hope it tells story of person who find way to be good again. Rowe felt tears threatening for the first time in years. This child who had every reason to hate him, who had suffered at the hands of people wearing the same uniform he had once worn, was offering him something he had never thought he deserved: forgiveness, and the chance to earn redemption through his actions rather than his past. "The bracelet is for me," he asked. "For both of us," Ayana corrected. "Coda is two people choosing to be family, choosing to be better together than alone." She came over to him then, and for the first time since finding the dog tags, she seemed like the child she was, rather than a judge weighing his worth. She climbed onto his lap and settled against his chest, still holding the bracelet. "You are not same person who wear uniform," she said quietly. "You are person who save scared girl in barn, person who keep promises, person who teach me English words, and let me teach you Lakota words. You are my Coda." As she spoke, Rowe realized that the crisis he had dreaded for months had passed. Not without pain, not without the difficult confrontation with truths he had hoped to avoid, but it had passed. And somehow, impossibly, their relationship was stronger for it. The secret that had haunted him was no longer a secret. The shame he had carried alone was now shared, and in sharing it, he had found something he never expected: a child wise enough to see past his failures to the man he was trying to become. Outside, the winter wind howled around the cabin, but inside, beside the fire, a former soldier and a tribal girl sat together, working on a beaded bracelet that would tell the story of how two broken people had chosen to heal each other. 3 days after Ayana's discovery of the dog tags, their hard-won peace was shattered by the sight that Rowe had been dreading since the first heavy snows began to fall. Smoke on the horizon, not the thin grey wisp of a chimney, but the thick black column that spoke of structures burning and lives in turmoil. He had been outside checking the horses when he saw it, rising from the direction of Pine Ridge like a dark finger pointed at the winter sky. Even at this distance, even through the haze of falling snow, there was no mistaking what that smoke meant. Something was very wrong in the valley below. Ayana found him standing motionless in the snow, staring at the distant column with the kind of stillness that comes from seeing fears made manifest. "What is it?" she asked, following his gaze to the horizon. "Trouble," Rowe said simply. "Big trouble coming our way." That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing what might be their last peaceful meal for some time, Rowe tried to explain what the smoke probably meant and what they would need to do to survive what was coming. "Someone's been looking for you," he said, keeping his voice gentle despite the gravity of what he was telling her. "I've seen signs for weeks, tracks that don't belong, disturbances in the forest that feel wrong. I think they finally decided to stop being careful about it." Ayana's hand moved instinctively to the sacred eagle feather she kept braided into her hair, the last physical connection to her grandmother's teachings and the spiritual traditions of her people. She had shown it to Rowe only once, explaining that it was her most precious possession, given to her during a naming ceremony when she was 4 years old. "They burned the town to find me?" she asked. "Maybe. Or maybe they're just asking questions in ways that make people nervous. Either way, it won't be long before someone remembers a mountain man who's been acting strange lately, buying children's clothes and extra supplies." The plan they developed over the next 2 days was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. If dangerous people were closing in on their location, their only option was to disappear deeper into the wilderness until spring made escape possible. Rowe knew these mountains better than any outsider ever could. But traveling in deep winter with a child would test every survival skill he possessed. They would have to abandon the cabin, the home that had become their sanctuary, and survive in the wilderness using nothing but what they could carry. It meant leaving behind the accumulated comforts of months together, the partition that gave Ayana privacy, the warm corner where she worked on her beadwork, The table where they shared meals and English lessons, most painfully. It meant leaving behind the physical reminders of the life Rowe had built with Helen and Charlotte. The wooden horse would stay in its drawer, along with Helen's Bible and the few photographs that were all he had left of his first family. The iron cross that had become a symbol of his promise to Ayana would come with them. But everything else would remain, perhaps to be destroyed by whoever came looking. As they prepared to leave, Ayana surprised him by offering to complete the beaded bracelet she had been working on for months. She spent the entire night before their departure working by firelight, her small fingers moving with urgent precision as she added the final elements to the pattern. "It tells our story," she explained as she worked. "Beginning, middle, and now, ending that becomes new beginning." When she finished, just as the pre-dawn light began to filter through the cabin windows, she held up the completed bracelet for him to see. It was beautiful, more than beautiful. It was a work of art that captured something essential about their journey together. The early beads were dark, speaking of sorrow and isolation. The middle section was brighter, telling the story of trust and healing. But the final portion was the most striking of all. Gold and silver beads arranged in a pattern that seemed to represent hope and continuity. The promise that their story would continue beyond the current crisis. "For both of us," she said, fastening the bracelet around his wrist. "To remember that we choose to be Coda no matter what happens." Rowe looked down at the bracelet, this thing of beauty created by child's hands, from scraps and whatever materials she could find, and felt the weight of what she was entrusting to him. Not just her safety, not just her future, but her faith that the bond they had formed was strong enough to survive whatever was coming. They left the cabin before sunrise on a grey December morning when the temperature was so low that their breath froze in the air and the snow crunched underfoot like broken glass. Rowe had loaded a small pack with essential supplies, food for several days, ammunition, medical supplies, and tools for survival in the wilderness. Everything else they would have to find or do without. Ayana carried her own small pack containing the medicine pouch, Helen's shirt, and a few other personal items. But her most precious possession, the eagle feather that connected her to her grandmother's teachings, remained braided into her hair, where it would stay close to her spirit, no matter where their journey led them. Their first destination was a cache Rowe had prepared years earlier in a cave system about 5 miles deeper into the mountains. It contained additional supplies, weapons, and most importantly, shelter that could keep them alive until they could make more permanent arrangements. But even as they set out on the treacherous journey, Rowe couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The tracks he had been noticing for weeks were more numerous now, and some of them were fresh enough to suggest that their pursuers were close, perhaps closer than the smoke from Pine Ridge had suggested. The first day of travel was exhausting but uneventful. They moved slowly through snow that sometimes reached Ayana's waist, following game trails and natural breaks in the forest that would make their passage less obvious to anyone trying to track them. Rowe's military training served them well. He knew how to minimize their trail, how to choose routes that would be difficult to follow, how to use terrain to their advantage. But he also knew that their pursuers probably had similar training, and unlike him, they weren't slowed down by the need to protect a child. That night, they sheltered in a grove of large pine trees, whose interlocking branches provided some protection from the wind and snow. They dared not build a fire that might give away their position, so they huddled together under blankets and shared body warmth while eating cold food from their packs. It was during those dark hours, as they lay listening to the wind howl through the trees above them, that Ayana asked the question Rowe had been dreading. "If they catch us," she said quietly, "what happens to me?" Rowe was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words that would be honest without being terrifying. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I promise you this, I won't let them take you without a fight. And if something happens to me, you remember everything I've taught you about surviving in these mountains. You're smart and strong, And you have skills your people taught you that I don't even know about. Whatever happens, you can survive this. I don't want to survive without you, she said. And the simple statement hit him harder than any declaration of love could have. You won't have to, he promised, though he wasn't sure it was a promise he could keep. We're going to get through this together. We're Coda, remember? That means we face everything together. The second day brought new challenges and new evidence that they were being pursued. Rowe spotted movement in the distance, figures on horseback moving with the purposeful coordination of an organized search party. They were still several miles away, but they were definitely following the general direction of Rowe and Ayana's route. More troubling, the pursuit seemed to involve more people than Rowe had expected. This wasn't just a small group of opportunistic raiders looking for a lost captive. This was a substantial operation with resources and coordination that suggested official backing. That realization forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about Ayana's situation. If government forces were involved in the search, if this was connected to official policy regarding tribal populations, then the stakes were much higher than he had imagined. By the end of the second day, they had covered less than half the distance to the cache, and their pursuers had closed the gap significantly. At their current rate of travel, they would be overtaken before they could reach the shelter and supplies that might give them a fighting chance. That night, as they sheltered in another grove of trees with the temperature dropping toward levels that could kill them, even with their blankets and shared warmth, Rowe made a decision that terrified him but seemed inevitable. Tomorrow, we're going to have to move faster, he told Ayana. Even if it means taking risks, even if it means being less careful about hiding our trail. We can't let them catch us in the open. Will we make it to the cave? She asked. We'll make it, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. One way or another, we'll make it. As she fell asleep against his shoulder, her eagle feather catching the faint starlight that filtered through the pine branches above them. Rowe stared out into the darkness and tried to prepare himself for what the next day might bring. He had faced combat before, had made life-and-death decisions under pressure, had carried out missions that required him to risk everything for the sake of his duty. But this was different. This time, he wasn't fighting for abstract principles or military objectives. He was fighting for the life of a child who had become more precious to him than his own. Survival, the bracelet on his wrist, caught what little light penetrated their shelter. Its beads telling the story of their journey together. But the story wasn't finished yet, and Rowe was determined that whatever ending they wrote together, it would be one they could both be proud of. Tomorrow would bring the test that would determine whether the bond they had forged was strong enough to survive the forces that sought to tear them apart. Tomorrow would determine whether a former cavalry sergeant and a Lakota child could overcome the history that should have made them enemies and prove that love chosen freely was stronger than any power that tried to destroy it as the wind howled around their fragile shelter and the cold pressed in from all sides. Rowe McKenzie held Ayana close and prepared to fight the most important battle of his life. Dawn came grey and bitter, with the kind of cold that made every breath feel like swallowing knives. Rowe awoke to find frost coating the inside of their blankets and Ayana shivering against his side despite their shared warmth. More troubling, he could hear something in the distance that made his blood run cold, the sound of horses moving through snow. Accompanied by voices that carried clearly in the thin mountain air, their pursuers had traveled through the night. They were close now, perhaps no more than a mile behind, and they were moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. Time to go, Rowe whispered, shaking Ayana gently awake. Right now. She came alert instantly, the kind of survival instinct that spoke of hard experience with danger. Within minutes, they had packed their few belongings and were moving through the pre-dawn darkness, following a deer trail that wound upward through increasingly treacherous terrain. The compass from Rowe's military days became their lifeline as they navigated through forests so thick with snow-laden branches that they could barely see 10 feet ahead. The brass instrument, worn smooth by years of use in countless campaigns, trembled slightly in his cold, stiffened fingers, but pointed steadily toward the cache that represented their only hope of survival. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more organized. Rowe could make out at least 4 distinct voices, possibly more, and the occasional sharp whistle that suggested military-style communication between separated units. These weren't random raiders or opportunistic bounty hunters. They were professionals, and they were closing in fast. The terrain worked in their favor for the first hour of travel. The steep, rocky slopes and dense forest cover made it difficult for mounted men to follow quickly, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses through the worst sections. But it also slowed Rowe and Ayanna, and the effort of breaking trail through deep snow was exhausting them both. By full daylight, they had covered perhaps 2 miles, but their pursuers had closed the distance to maybe half a mile. Rowe could see them occasionally through breaks in the forest, dark figures moving with grim purpose against the white landscape, following their trail with the persistence of bloodhounds. "How much further?" Ayanna asked, her breath coming in sharp puffs that spoke of the strain she was under. Despite her youth and the survival skills learned from her people, she was still a child, and this kind of sustained physical effort in extreme conditions was pushing her to her limits. "Another mile, maybe less," Rowe replied, though he wasn't entirely sure. The landmarks he remembered from his previous visits to the cache were obscured by snow, and navigating by compass alone in this terrain was challenging, even for someone with his experience. They pressed on, driven by necessity and the growing certainty that capture would mean death, if not immediately, then in whatever institution or facility their pursuers planned to take Ayanna. The rope burns on her wrists had healed, but Rowe would never forget what they represented. He would die before he let anyone put chains on this child again. The break in their favor came unexpectedly, in the form of a natural feature that Rowe had forgotten about until they nearly stumbled into it. A narrow ravine, perhaps 15 feet deep and barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, cut across their path like a scar in the mountainside. Snow had drifted over the opening, making it nearly invisible until they were right on top of it. "Down there," Rowe said, pointing into the ravine. "We can move faster along the bottom, and they'll have trouble tracking us." The descent was treacherous, a controlled slide down icy rocks that could have broken bones if either of them had slipped wrong. But they made it to the bottom safely, and suddenly they were moving through a natural corridor that was sheltered from the wind and mostly clear of deep snow. For 20 precious minutes, they made good time, following the ravine as it wound roughly in the direction of the cache. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit faded as their trail disappeared into what their pursuers would see as impassable terrain. But the ravine couldn't go on forever, and when it finally opened out onto a broad slope covered with aspen trees, they found themselves exposed again. Worse, the cache was still at least half a mile ahead, up a steep grade that would leave them visible to anyone following their trail. That's when they saw him, a lone rider positioned on a ridge about a quarter-mile to their left, obviously watching for their emergence from the ravine. He raised something to his face, field glasses, then lowered them and made a sharp whistle that echoed across the mountainside. "They've got us bracketed," Rowe said grimly. "That rider was waiting for us to come out exactly where we did." The response to the whistle came quickly, answering calls from at least 3 different directions, the sound of a coordinated search closing in on their position. These people knew what they were doing, and they had enough resources to position observers at multiple possible escape routes. "What do we do?" Ayanna asked, and for the first time since their flight began, there was real fear in her voice. Rowe looked at the terrain ahead, calculating distances and angles with the tactical awareness he had developed during years of cavalry operations. The cache was still achievable if they moved fast, and if they were willing to take risks that could get them both killed. "We run," he said simply, "straight up that slope, as fast as we can go. Don't look back, don't stop for anything. If something happens to me, you keep going until you reach the cache. I won't leave you. You will if you have to." Rowe interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "You're the important one here, Ayana. You're the one with a future to protect. Promise me that if something happens, you'll save yourself." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much for someone her age, and he could see her struggling with the promise he was asking for. But finally she nodded. "I promise," she said. "But nothing will happen. We are Coda. We face everything together." The ascent began as a controlled rush, both of them moving as quickly as the terrain and their endurance allowed. The compass stayed in Rowe's hand, its needle pointing steadily toward salvation as they climbed through snow that sometimes reached their knees. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit intensified as their trail became visible again. Shouts, the crash of horses moving through underbrush, the sharp commands of men coordinating a final push to overtake their quarry. Halfway up the slope, Rowe's worst fears were realized. A shot rang out across the mountainside, not aimed at them but fired into the air as a signal. More shots followed, and then he could see riders emerging from the forest below, at least 6 men on horseback moving with the grim efficiency of a military unit, closing in for the kill. "Faster," he told Ayana, though she was already pushing herself to the limits of her endurance. The cache was close now, just a few hundred yards ahead, hidden in a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural fortress. If they could reach it, they would have weapons, supplies, and a defensible position. If they could reach it, another shot, closer this time, and Rowe heard the distinctive whine of a bullet passing nearby. Their pursuers were close enough to start taking aimed shots, which meant they had perhaps minutes before being overtaken. That's when Ayana stumbled. She went down hard, her small body disappearing into a drift that was deeper than the surrounding snow. For a moment that felt like hours, Rowe couldn't see her, couldn't hear her, could only imagine her injured or unconscious in the snow while their enemies closed in. Then she emerged, gasping and covered with snow but unharmed. "I'm okay," she said. But he could see that the fall had shaken her, had reminded her how close they were to the edge of their endurance. "Almost there," he said, reaching down to help her up. Just a little bit further. As they resumed their desperate climb, Rowe found himself gripping the compass tighter, using it not just as a navigation tool, but as a talisman, a symbol of all the battles he had fought and survived. It had guided him through hostile territory before, had brought him safely home from places where good men died for causes they barely understood. Now it was guiding him toward the most important objective of his life, a place where he could make a stand to protect the child who had given his existence meaning again. The cache lay just ahead, and with it, the weapons and ammunition that would let him fight for Ayana's freedom, with something more than desperate hope. They reached the cache just as the first of their pursuers crested the ridge behind them. Rowe had chosen this location years ago for its defensive advantages. A natural fortress of massive granite boulders that formed a rough circle, with only 2 narrow approaches that could be easily defended. Now, as bullets began to whine off the rocks around them, he was grateful for his old soldier's instincts. The cache itself was hidden beneath a carefully arranged pile of stones that looked natural but concealed a waterproof container holding everything they needed for a prolonged fight. Ammunition, a spare rifle, dried food, medical supplies, and most importantly, a cache of black powder that could turn the tide if used strategically. "Stay down," Rowe commanded as he pried away the concealing stones with desperate efficiency. More shots echoed across the mountainside, some of them close enough to spray granite chips across his hands as he worked. Ayana crouched behind the largest boulder, her dark eyes wide but alert as she watched their attackers position themselves for an assault. Despite her fear, she was thinking tactically, pointing out movement that Rowe might have missed. "There," she said, indicating a figure trying to work his way around to their left flank. "And 2 more behind the big tree." Rowe looked where she pointed and felt a grim satisfaction at her awareness. She was learning to think like a survivor, to see threats and opportunities the way someone who intended to live through this fight needed to see them. The first rifle came out of the cache like a prayer answered. A 44-40 Winchester that he'd kept in perfect condition against the possibility that he might someday need it to defend his life. The ammunition followed, and then he was loading with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual under fire more times than he cared to remember. "Listen to me carefully," he said as he worked. "I need you to do something very important, and I need you to do it exactly as I tell you." Ayanna nodded, her small face set with determination. "See that gap between the rocks, about 20 feet behind us?" Rowe pointed to a narrow opening that led deeper into the boulder field. "If things go bad, if they overrun our position, you go through there. It leads to a hidden path that will take you down the backside of the mountain. You follow that path until you reach the creek, then follow the creek downstream until you find people. I won't leave you." "You will if you have to," Rowe said firmly. "That's an order from your coda. If I fall, you run. You survive. You find a way to live the life your grandmother would have wanted for you." Before she could argue further, a voice called out from the rocks below, authoritative, used to being obeyed, carrying the unmistakable tone of military command. "McKenzie, we know you're up there. Send the girl down and nobody has to get hurt." The use of his name sent a chill down Rowe's spine. These people knew exactly who he was, which meant they had done their research. This wasn't a random pursuit. It was a targeted operation with official backing and detailed intelligence. "Who are you?" Rowe called back, though he was already positioning himself for the first shot he would need to take. "Territorial Marshal Hawthorne Briggs," came the reply. "I have legal authority to recover that child and return her to proper custody." "You're interfering with official business." Rowe felt something cold settle in his chest. A territorial marshal meant federal authority, meant resources and legitimacy that would make their escape infinitely more difficult. But it also meant that whatever had happened to Ayanna's village, whatever institution she'd escaped from, had official sanction. "What kind of proper custody?" he called back. "The Carlisle Industrial School," Briggs replied, "where she'll receive a proper Christian education and learn to be a useful member of civilized society." Ayanna's sharp intake of breath told Rowe everything he needed to know about what that meant. Carlisle was one of the government's industrial boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. Institutions where native children were stripped of their language, culture and identity in the name of forced assimilation. The rope burns on Ayanna's wrists suddenly made perfect sense. She hadn't escaped from random captors. She had escaped from one of these schools, from an institution that used chains and beatings to enforce compliance with its civilizing mission. "She stays with me," Rowe called back. "I'm afraid that's not your choice to make," Briggs replied. "You have 5 minutes to send her down, or we come up and take her." Rowe looked at Ayanna, seeing in her eyes the same terror he had witnessed that first day in the barn. She knew what going back would mean. The systematic destruction of everything that made her who she was. The slow death of her spirit in the name of civilized progress. "Never," he said quietly, meant for her ears alone. "I will never let them take you back to that place." She nodded, then surprised him by pulling something from her hair, the sacred eagle feather that represented her connection to her grandmother's teachings and the spiritual traditions of her people. She held it up so that it caught what little sunlight penetrated their rocky shelter. "This is who I am," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the mountainside. "This is what they want to kill, but it will not die. Even if they take me, even if they cut my hair and burn my clothes and beat me for speaking my grandmother's language. This," she touched the feather to her heart, "will not die." Marshal Briggs's voice carried a note of impatience when he called out again. "Time's up, McKenzie. Send her down now, or we're coming up." Rowe's answer was the sharp crack of the Winchester as he put his first shot exactly where he intended it, close enough to the marshal's position to spray snow in his face. Far enough away to make clear that he could have killed him if he'd chosen to. "Come ahead," Rowe called back. "But understand that you're not taking her alive. If you want her, you'll have to go through me." And I promise you that's going to cost more than you're willing to pay." The response was immediate and overwhelming, a concentrated volley of rifle fire that turned the air around their position into a lethal storm of lead and granite fragments. Rowe pressed himself against the largest boulder and pulled Ayanna close, feeling the solid rock shudder under the impact of multiple bullets. When the firing stopped, he risked a quick look and saw what he'd expected. The marshal's men were advancing under cover of the barrage, moving with the coordinated precision of experienced fighters. They would be in assault range within minutes, and once they closed to that distance, his defensive advantage would disappear. "Remember what I told you," he said to Ayanna as he lined up his next shot. "If this goes bad, you run. You don't look back, you don't hesitate, you just run and keep running until you're safe." "I remember," she said. "But it won't go bad. We are Coda. We face everything together, and we win together." Her faith in him was both inspiring and terrifying. She believed absolutely that he could protect her, that their bond was stronger than the forces arrayed against them. He only hoped her faith wasn't misplaced. The Winchester spoke again, and one of the advancing figures dropped behind cover with a sharp cry of pain. Not a killing shot, but enough to slow the advance and remind their attackers that this wouldn't be the easy capture they had expected. As he worked the lever and loaded another round, Rowe found himself thinking about the beaded bracelet on his wrist, about the story it told of broken people choosing to heal each other. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he had kept faith with that story. He had chosen to protect someone who needed protection, had chosen love over duty, had chosen to be the man his daughter would have been proud of, rather than the soldier who had followed orders without question. The sound of another volley filled the air. But this time Rowe was ready for it, and when it ended, he would begin the fight that would determine whether love chosen freely was stronger than law imposed by force. The sound that changed everything wasn't gunfire or shouted commands, but something far more unexpected, the clear, carrying notes of a traditional Lakota war song rising from somewhere beyond the ridge. Ayanna's head snapped up at the first note, her eyes wide with disbelief and sudden hope. "Honka," she whispered, using a word Rowe didn't recognize, but whose meaning became clear as figures appeared on the surrounding ridges, mounted warriors in traditional dress, their faces painted for war, their weapons trained not on Rowe and Ayanna, but on Marshal Briggs and his men. The singing continued, joined by other voices as more riders emerged from positions that must have taken hours to reach unseen. They had been watching, waiting, following the pursuit with the patience of hunters who understood that timing meant everything. Marshal Briggs's voice carried a note of uncertainty for the first time as he called out new orders. "Fall back! Defensive positions!" But it was too late for defensive positions. The Lakota warriors had chosen their moment perfectly, appearing when Briggs's men were committed to an assault position with no cover and no escape routes. Within minutes, the hunters had become the hunted. A new voice called out across the mountainside, speaking in Lakota, but with an authority that needed no translation. An older man rode forward, his horse picking its way carefully through the snow, his bearing unmistakably that of a war chief or respected elder. Ayanna rose from behind the boulder, her sacred eagle feather catching the winter sunlight as she called back in her own language. The exchange was brief but emotional, and Rowe could see tears streaming down her face, tears of joy rather than fear. "My uncle," she said, turning to Rowe with a smile that transformed her entire face. "My father's brother. He has been looking for me since the soldiers took me. The standoff that followed was tense, but not violent. Marshal Briggs and his remaining men found themselves surrounded by warriors who had every tactical advantage, and more importantly, every moral justification for what they were doing. The federal government might have legal authority over tribal affairs, but that authority meant nothing in the face of armed men defending their own children. The negotiations were conducted in a mixture of English, Lakota, and careful diplomacy. Ayanna served as translator, her improved English allowing her to bridge the gap between two worlds that had been at war for generations. But the conversation that mattered most took place between her and her uncle, a man whose face bore the weathered dignity of someone who had fought to preserve his people's way of life against overwhelming odds. From their animated discussion, conducted partly in Lakota and partly in the careful English she had learned from Rowe, a story emerged that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The attack on her village hadn't been random. It had been part of a systematic campaign to force tribal children into government boarding schools. Families who resisted had their children taken by force, often under the pretense of legal authority that existed mainly on paper. But Ayana's escape from the Carlisle school had triggered something unexpected, a coordinated effort by multiple tribal groups to track down their missing children and bring them home. Her uncle had been leading one of several search parties that had been following various leads across the territory for months. They were close, she explained to Rowe, her eyes shining with the realization that she hadn't been abandoned after all, following the same trail as the marshal, but from different direction. When they heard shooting, they knew they found something important. Marshal Briggs, faced with a situation that had spiraled far beyond his ability to control, made the pragmatic decision that his political survival required. Rather than risk a massacre that would bring unwanted attention to the government's methods of child removal, he agreed to withdraw his men and report that the fugitive had been lost in the wilderness. It was a face-saving lie that served everyone's interests. Briggs avoided a costly battle. The tribal groups avoided federal retaliation, and Ayana avoided being dragged back to an institution designed to destroy everything that made her who she was. But the resolution of the immediate crisis raised questions that would take longer to answer. Ayana had found her surviving family, but she had also found something else in her months with Rowe, a different kind of family. A chosen bond that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. The solution they worked out over the following hours was as unconventional as their relationship had been from the beginning. Rather than choosing between her birth family and her chosen family, Ayana would have both. She would spend part of each year with her uncle's band, learning the traditional ways and maintaining her connection to her people's culture. But she would also spend time with Rowe, continuing her education in English and the skills that would help her navigate between two worlds. More significantly, Rowe would serve as a bridge between the tribal communities and the territorial government, using his military background and frontier knowledge to help negotiate better conditions for tribal families threatened by forced assimilation policies. It was a role that would give him purpose beyond his own healing, a way to use his past service in the cause of justice rather than oppression. 6 months later, as spring returned to the Montana mountains and the snow melted to reveal the new green of another growing season, Rowe stood on his cabin porch and marveled at how much his world had changed. The cabin itself had been expanded and modified to accommodate visitors, a separate room for Ayana when she stayed with him, improvements that made it suitable for the tribal delegations who now came regularly to discuss matters of mutual concern. The beaded bracelet on his wrist had grown longer over the winter, with new sections added by both Ayana and the skilled artisans among her people. It now told a more complete story, not just of two individuals healing each other, but of communities learning to bridge ancient divisions through understanding and mutual respect. Ayana herself had grown in ways that went beyond mere physical development. Her English had become fluent, but she had also deepened her knowledge of Lakota traditions under her uncle's guidance. She moved easily between both worlds now, equally comfortable discussing literature with Rowe and participating in traditional ceremonies with her tribal family. But perhaps the most significant change was in Rowe himself. The isolation that had protected him from further loss had given way to a different kind of strength, the strength that came from accepting responsibility for something larger than his own survival. He had found redemption not in forgetting his past, but in using it to serve a cause that honored the memory of his daughter and wife. The adoption necklace that Ayana's people had given him hung beside Helen's cross, a symbol of acceptance that he had never expected to receive. It marked him as honorary family, someone who had earned the right to be trusted with their children's welfare, not because of his position or authority, but because of his willingness to risk everything to protect one vulnerable child. On quiet evenings, when Ayana was visiting her tribal family, and the mountain returned to something like its old silence, Rowe would sometimes walk up the hill behind his cabin to the graves of Helen and Charlotte. The conversations he held there were different now, not the desperate monologues of a man trying to hold on to ghosts, but the reflective discussions of someone who had found a way to honor the dead by serving the living. "She would have liked Ayana," he would say, speaking to Helen's headstone as the sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. They would have been good friends, I think. Both of them too smart for their own good. Both of them with hearts big enough to forgive people who didn't deserve it. The wooden horse that Charlotte had loved remained in its honored place in his dresser drawer, but it was no longer a symbol of loss. It had become a reminder of the continuity of love, how caring for one child could honor the memory of another, how the capacity to nurture and protect was perhaps the most important gift parents could pass on to the world. As autumn approached again and Ayana prepared to spend the winter months with her tribal family, learning the deep traditions that would anchor her identity for the rest of her life, she gave Rowe a gift that captured everything their relationship had meant to both of them. It was a new section for his journal, pages she had decorated with traditional designs and filled with her own words, written in the careful English he had taught her. The first page read, "This is the story of how a broken soldier and a lost girl became Coda, family chosen by love rather than blood. It is the story of how two people from different worlds learned that healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from choosing to build something better in the present. It is the story of how the strongest families are sometimes the ones we create when circumstances force us to choose between what is easy and what is right." Below her words, in the margins, she had drawn pictures that told the same story her beaded bracelet had told, images of fear transformed into trust, isolation transformed into community, and most importantly, two figures walking together toward a horizon that promised hope rather than merely survival. As Rowe read her words by firelight, he realized that the story she had written was more than just their personal journey. It was a testament to the possibility that people from different worlds, different cultures, different histories of conflict, could find common ground in their shared humanity. The mountains around them held their secrets in patient silence, the same peaks that had witnessed wars and peace treaties, moments of hatred and moments of grace. But tonight, in one small cabin where an unlikely family had learned to bridge the divisions that should have kept them apart, those mountains were witnessing something that felt like hope made real, the proof that love chosen freely could indeed be stronger than any force that sought to destroy it. Outside, the first snow of the new season began to fall, each flake catching the light from the cabin windows like tiny stars carrying promises of storm.